Welcome to the second half of another Authors at Google doubleheader today. It's a pleasure to have Eric Alterman with us this afternoon. He's a professor of journalism at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism and a professor of English at Brooklyn College. He maintains the political blog Altercation, which was originally hosted on MSNBC.com and is now part of Media Matters for America. Eric holds a BA in History and Government from Cornell, an MA in International Relations from Yale, and a PhD in U.S. History from Stanford. He is the author of 7 books, most recently Why We're Liberals, a political handbook for post-Bush America, which he'll be speaking about today, and which hopefully most of you have in your hands right now. He'll be speaking and then taking questions from the audience. If you do have a question for him, please wait for the microphone to arrive, as we are recording this for YouTube and also video conferencing to the sites you see up there. After the event, he'll be signing books for anyone who is interested and would like to stick around. So with that, please join me in welcoming Eric Alterman to Google.
Thanks. It's such a pleasure to meet you face-to-face after spending so much time together on the internet. Really, it's very interesting for me to be here. I did go to Stanford. I don't know, was Google always here? Google wasn't here in 93, 94, right? No, and it's a whole new world now. It's also a little odd for me. Actually, I've had some trouble on this book tour. My first two readings didn't actually take place. One, the books didn't arrive, and the second one, I arrived for it 24 hours late. Talking about the media was much smaller than it is today, and I was considered, I guess, much more of a threat in those days, or by whoever my opposition was. And every time I was scheduled to give a talk at a bookstore, someone would call the bookstore and cancel it. And I would arrive and it would be canceled. Well, we figured it out, and so it only happened twice. But one time when they tried it, they did it at a bookstore in L.A. that that C-SPAN had come to record, so that for their programs, and that one didn't work because C-SPAN called my publisher. My publisher said no, I wasn't sick, I was fine. But when they realized, whoever it was realized they hadn't been able to cancel it, they killed all the electricity at the bookstore in the middle of the talk. And this is one of those bookstores, I think it's gone now, like so many independent bookstores, but it's one of those bookstores where nobody knew where the fuse boxes were, So in order to hold on to C-SPAN, I had to tell jokes to the audience for 45 minutes. And I don't know 45 minutes worth of clean jokes. I don't even think there are 45 minutes worth of clean jokes. So so on the one hand, now the trouble I run into with my book talks are much more easily explicable. It's not like I'm important enough to send an agent out, to destroy me. You heard, by the way, this is just a small factoid, since I'm here and we're talking about the history of the internet. When I was, and we can talk about this later. I don't want to talk for very long. I'd much rather talk to you guys, because, to be honest, when I give book talks, the people who come to see me, by and large, agree with me. Sometimes people who really like Ralph Nader come to argue with me, but mostly it's a self-selected group of people who consider themselves liberals and so forth, and are sort of want what the New York Times called intellectual vitamins. But I'd be interested to talk to people, who work here and might have a different perspective, and I think it'll be useful for me and hopefully for you. But in terms of my role in the history of the internet, I do believe that when MSNBC asked me to found this blog, Altercation, in May of 2002, that it was the very first mainstream media blog anywhere. Some of them were adapted later, like some people there were people who blogged before me, good journalists who had blogs and had started off independently, and they actually deserve a lot more credit than I do, because they took a leap in the dark and I just took a paycheck. But I do think that MSNBC was first in deciding that they wanted a blogger, and they picked me, and so that's I'm selling that as my role in the history of the net. I went to high school with this guy. Some of you might have met him or heard of him, named Brewster Kahle. I think he's He's internet famous, right? He was such a nerd in high school, which is the way it always is, I'm told. And I sent him an email with that, and I understand he keeps the records for this thing, or that's how it's been explained to me. Anyway, so I have this new book here called Why We're Liberals, which Google was nice enough to provide me with this space. And the book for me, it's really two books. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the table of contents, but it's two really quite separate books. The first book is called What is This Thing Called Liberal?, in which I try to describe what does it mean to be a liberal, which is not an easy thing to do. It takes me 10 pages, and I'm very proud of getting it down to 10 pages. It's not a big problem liberals have is that it's very hard to describe what it means to be liberal, whereas conservatives can describe it what they are, their philosophy, quite easily, although I'm hard-pressed to find a conservative in power who actually adheres to their philosophy, but they can describe it. And then there's a section, what does liberalism look like? This is still in the first section, where I pick out sort of policies from countries, mostly in northern Western Europe, that are liberal countries, that have, or at least have liberal governments. And these are policies which I think have better outcomes in terms of their social policies and economic policies than does the United States. And then I have a very long section called, so what is the problem? And then I don't really try and make a hierarchy of these problems, but I give you a long laundry list of a whole set of problems as to why, if liberalism is such a great idea and it works so well when it's applied in Finland and Sweden and to some degree France and Germany and even England, why don't we have more of it here? And there's a whole lot of reasons, many of which are liberals' own fault, many of which have to do with a conservative propaganda offensive that's lasted about 40 years that has been, in my view, swallowed and regurgitated by the opinion media, which I consider to be quite conservative. I don't think reporters are themselves conservatives, but I do think the opinion media is dominated by conservatives. And I wrote a book about that called What Liberal Media a few years ago. And then some of them are just God's fault. Here's one that's God's fault. Liberals all live together in the same place, and conservatives spread themselves out very well. So I live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and my vote is worth about 1/300th of what people who live in Alaska's vote is, and 1/70th of what people who live in Wyoming's vote is in the Senate. And even in the House, it's not fairly apportioned. And so, for instance, most people here will remember the election of 1994 when we had the Gingrich Revolution, and the House and Senate went from Republican to Democratic. And then this past election in 2006, the opposite happened. And if you look at the apportionment of House seats from those two elections, fewer House seats switched sides in 2006 than in 1994, but actually far more votes changed, both as a percentage of the population and as a percentage of the number of votes that had been in the previous election. So liberals waste a lot of votes because they live together. That's just a fact of life. There's nothing to be done about that. I'm giving you an example of one that's God's fault. The ones that are either liberals' fault or the victory of conservative propaganda are usually more interesting. Now, in light of that second point about the victory of conservative propaganda, that leads me to the second 2/3 of the book, which if you look at the table of contents, that one's called And Why Do They Hate America? And what I've tried to do in that section is to take all of what I understand to be are the cliches that people hold about liberals. I state them in sort of, I overstate some of them for the sake of being, I hope, humorous. Like, why do liberals believe in marriage only for homosexuals? Why are liberals educating our children to be perverts? Why do liberals hate religion? Why do liberals hate the Jews? When will liberals stop undermining our values and poisoning the minds of America's youth? That kind of thing. It's my view that it's not only, these are not only the purview of Rush Limbaugh and Bill O'Reilly and people like that, but that these are views that permeate the mainstream media, albeit often in more polite terms. And what I do in those chapters, and I'll be happy to take any example, is is make the argument, and I think with lots of data, that, that these accusations apply far better to conservatives than they do to liberals. I mean, I think liberals, if you take a look at the abuse that has been heaped on our military, for instance, in the past 7 years by the Bush administration, there's, sending soldiers into battle to do a job they were never trained to do, not giving them proper equipment to protect themselves, cutting their veterans benefits and their health benefits upon their return, doing all these stop-loss orders, and then, you know, not providing, making it impossible for the military to sustain the numbers it needs to do its missions elsewhere in the world. All at the same time, policies undertaken by people who have never themselves served in the military. Virtually no one who planned this war had served in the military. The only really prominent example was Colin Powell, and he was pretty much opposed to the war, as most people would have been if they had a sort of typical prudence about how to use military power, which was entirely lacking, or even a sensible prudence. In any case, so that's the book I've written. Now here's why I wrote the book. If you ask, if you do a public opinion survey and you say, are you a liberal, conservative, or moderate to America, the numbers are pretty stable. You get approximately 20% people saying that they're liberals, approximately 33% saying they're conservatives, and approximately 40% saying they're either moderates or nothing. And yet, if you ask people, what do you think we should do about global warming? If you ask people, what do you think we should do about our taxation policies? If you ask people, what is your view about labor unions? If you ask people, what is your view of a woman's right to choose? No matter how you phrase, I mean, unless you phrase the question incredibly aggressively. If you ask people, what do you ask them questions about scientific research versus religious impinging on that for things like stem cell research. If you ask them, what is the role of the government in terms of protecting the little person against big business? If you ask them any question having to do with the Bush foreign policy and the doctrines that underlie it, you will get, I can't think of a single exception off the top of my head, and if you ask me for the examples, I'll find the page and read it to you. You'll get approximately 65% in favor of the liberal position on all of those. So the conservative position on the issues is held by about 35% on issue after issue, and the liberal position is held anywhere from 55 to 70%. And yet, nobody wants to call themselves a liberal. Now, a lot of people say, well, you could solve this problem very easily and just call yourself a progressive, and actually, that's what Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama are both doing. And if you call yourself a progressive, you know, the ex-candidate who switches from liberal to progressive gets a 19-point bump just for doing that. So you go from 22 to 41 in one of these surveys just for changing your name. But I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think it's a good idea. I'm going to just read 2 paragraphs that I hope will illustrate what I'm thinking. From page 1. I'm skipping the first paragraph. I don't like to read, but I just think I did a good job here of laying out what I think the problem is, better than I could do if I continue just to ramble on here. Ever since Richard Nixon walloped George McGovern in the presidential election of 1972, political pundits have treated as a truism the proposition that liberals are out of step with the rest of the nation and therefore all but unelectable outside the precincts of the Northeast, give or take a college town here or a ski resort there. During the course of every presidential election for the past 40 years, Republicans have sought to wield the word liberal as if it were a 6-gauge shotgun. Senator Kerry is rated as the most liberal member of the United States Senate, and he chose a fellow lawyer who is the 4th most liberal member of the United States Senate. President Bush joked. Back in Massachusetts, that's what they call balancing the ticket. Asked to respond, the man from Massachusetts complained but did not defend. It's not real, Kerry told USA Today about the Massachusetts liberal tag. That stuff is just old hokey that doesn't stand up. People know it's a lot of malarkey. His running mate, John Edwards, was hardly more forthcoming. Asked by Ted Koppel, are you a liberal? He responded, no, I don't believe in labels, first of all. I don't think they mean anything. I think what John Kerry and I are mainstream America. As Newt Gingrich has pointedly observed, Kerry says labels are misleading because he understands labels are the end of his campaign. Now, none of you know me, but if you did know me, you'd know that you are about to witness a historic occasion. I'm about to quote Rush Limbaugh making a sensible observation, saying something that's actually true. Even Rush Limbaugh proved uncharacteristically accurate when he pointed out that conservatives evince no such reticence when it comes to labeling. Somebody calls me a conservative, he teased his tongue-tied opponents. I flex my muscles and say, yeah, baby, you want to call me a right-winger? Hell yes, I'm a right-winger. But you call them liberals, they don't want any part of it. They get defensive. What do you mean by that? Why do you always have to use the L word? You know it doesn't mean anything. Well, it does. It means a lot. As Mike Kinsley pointed out during the 2004 Democratic Convention, it's true enough that this is a moment when Democrats are called upon to reject extreme liberalism, whatever that might be, and to embrace moderation. But that is only because every moment is such a moment. He termed this meme one of the safest in all punditry, which, trust me, is really saying something, as the old song goes. Liberals who are afraid to call themselves liberals or reluctant to call themselves liberals face a conundrum, which is that they can't condemn liberalism because, in a Democratic primary, a significant percentage, if not a majority of voters, are in fact liberals. So that's the 20%. Very few people vote in primaries. So if 30% of people vote in primary, that's a lot. And so in Democratic primary, 2/3 of the people who vote are going to be those self-identified liberals. So they can't denounce liberalism, but they can't embrace it either. And so they are tongue-tied. They sound wimpy. They sound like they're running away. Just so happens that this issue is covered with regard to Barack Obama on the front page of today's New York Times, where he is also running away from the label. Even though I thought a very compelling column in The Nation about how he didn't listen to me. I said that ironically. Again, you don't know me, so I don't expect him to listen to me. But anyway, I think it's a mistake. Okay. Or eat rye bread. Yeah. So what happens is that liberals look the way that they are painted by conservatives as people who won't stand up for themselves. As Robert Lowell famously said of them, they won't take their own side in a fight. The last president to call himself a liberal, the last presidential candidate to call himself a liberal was John Kennedy, who spoke to the New York State Liberal Party and said, if by liberal you mean all these horrible things, then no, of course I'm not a liberal. But if by liberal you mean, and then he proceeded to define what he meant by liberal. Then he said, well, I'm proud to call myself a liberal. Now, it was, I guess, already a little controversial for Kennedy to do that because he had to give that long introduction. But for the longest time since the New Deal, the word liberal was something that a politician really had to be taken seriously as a national politician. Dwight Eisenhower called himself a liberal. Richard Nixon called himself a liberal. Believe it or not, Joe McCarthy thought that the problem with the liberals that he was accusing of being treasonous were that they weren't good liberals. But he thought good liberals were good. He just couldn't find any. So liberal was a term of honor that no one was willing to take on from the 1930s, even before that really, through about 1960. And then in the 1960s, as you all know, liberalism was blamed for many, many social ills, a number of which it was actually responsible. Liberals did a lot of stupid things in the 1960s and 70s. Liberalism devolved into a creed that I would have trouble defending in many respects, and not in all respects, but in many respects. And it made a lot of significant political mistakes. I mean, I for one, am someone who thinks it was right and proper for Lyndon Johnson to sign the 1964 Civil Rights Act, even though, as he did so, he said, "I'm destroying the Democratic Party for the next for the next two generations in the South." I think some things are worth that kind of sacrifice, but you didn't have to attempt to address the United States. The legacy of hundreds of years of racial discrimination by telling your primary political constituency, which was white working class voters, that they were going to be paying the price for it, that it was going to be their jobs that were going to be set aside for minorities, it was going to be their neighborhoods that were going to be transformed, it was going to be their schools that were going to be bused to and from, and that if they objected, they were ipso facto racist. That was a really bad political strategy. And that's a kind of that was kind of a template for liberals who, for a long time and too often, felt that because they felt themselves to be morally correct, they didn't really need to explain themselves to anyone. That they didn't even need to worry about the consequences of what they were doing. I mean, obviously, affirmative action, whether you support it or not, it has very complex consequences, and many of these are going to be unintended. And liberals acted as if, by the fact that they were securing what they understood to be the just rewards of historic injustices, as if that was enough, as if there was no need to like look into the details of the policy and to redress some of the problems it created. Well, around that time, conservative wealthy people, billionaires, and also some heads of corporations started investing hundreds of millions of dollars in creating an alternative intellectual and media structure designed to take the country back from the establishment that they felt was overly liberal and not sympathetic to them. They began to feel this way when they saw the way that the civil rights movement was treated, that there was no sympathy at all for the segregationist position in the national media. And then during the election of Barry Goldwater, they saw their values mocked and treated with contempt. And actually, they were right to feel that way. I mean, maybe they deserved the mockery, but they certainly were treated that way. At the end of the 1964 election, national pundits like Walter Lippmann were wondering if the Republican Party could survive unless it moved to the left of the Democratic Party. In any case, the net result was that they created this enormous movement that has successfully transformed our discourse by attaching all of these incredibly unfavorable and unattractive qualities to the word liberal. So liberals are taken to be unpatriotic, to be anti-religious, to not care about children's values and helping parents raise their children, to be particularly elitist. Elitism is a big problem. That word pops up all the time. And as I say, in this, if you look at the details of policy, I think you'll find that most of these accusations, I mean, they're kind of broad to attach to any large group of people, but to the degree that you look at the results of how this country's been governed, they apply much better to Republicans than Democrats. And I'm using Republicans and Democrats as examples of relatively liberal and relatively conservative. Although, as I said, we haven't really had a liberal president, I would say not since Franklin Roosevelt, a proud liberal president. But I'll give you just two examples that I think are illustrative, and then I hope we'll be able to have some discussion. If you take this idea of smaller government, right, that's conservatives are for small government. What else? What does it mean to be a conservative if you're not for small government? Well, almost without exception, under every Republican president, the size of the government relative to the economy has grown far quicker than it has under Democratic president. On the last two, under Bill Clinton, the size of the government shrank from 21% of the GDP to 19 point something, just below 20. Under George Bush today, it's about 23%. And that's with pretty good tax returns. The tax returns aren't going to stay that high. So George Bush has increased the size of the government enormously. And this is consistent with previous Republican presidents and previous Democratic presidents. And by the way, you might not say that this is as much of an ideological issue, but Democrats have also had a much better record for economic growth. Conservatives are supposed to care about economic growth. Liberals are supposed to care about redistributing that growth, redistributing the product of that growth. Well, in fact, growth, the engine of growth has been much stronger under Democratic presidents historically, and again, virtually without exception, than under Republicans. To take another example at random, you often hear about the problem of liberal judicial activism. That the judges are legislating over the heads of people and ignoring the democratic intent of the people. Now, I actually think there's some truth to that when it comes to the issue of abortion. And I think that's why it sticks in people's heads so much, that in terms of Roe v. Wade, that was a liberal decision, and it was done against the democratic wishes of many of the states. That, and I think that was a political mistake, and one that liberals still pay for. But the fact is that, if you run the numbers, far more congressional laws have been overturned by justices appointed by Republican presidents than Democratic presidents, and far more judicial precedents have been overturned by justices appointed by Republicans than Democrats. And again, I could go through this on issue after issue. Now, usually when I speak to liberal groups, I say, and I'll say it here just so you know what I go around saying, I say that liberals suffer from a kind of Stockholm syndrome, that liberals have internalized a lot of this critique that has very little merit in a normative fashion. It reminds me of, if you remember Al Gore's 2000 campaign. You know, Al Gore never said he invented the internet. He never said that he discovered Love Canal. He never even said that he was the model for Oliver and Love Story, which was a very big issue at the time. He said things which, if taken out of context, could be interpreted to imply that, but he never said those things. And in fact, what he said in context, and if you're interested, we can talk about it, I remember them. I mean, I have them in my other book. They were perfectly unobjectionable. But Gore was so overwhelmed by the repetition of these themes during that campaign that he ended up making jokes about his having invented the internet. By the way, there was one, this is really off topic, but a friend of mine wrote this great joke for Al Gore during the campaign on this very topic that Gore didn't have the nerve to use, but I'll tell it to you because it's such a great joke. Remember when Gore's grades came out and they were no better than Bush's, like Gore the smarty pants didn't do any better at Harvard than Bush did at Yale, and everybody was shocked, and they asked Gore about his grades, and he said, "Oh yeah, that was the year I invented the bong." Maybe, I mean, he probably should have said that because his reputation was as such a stiff that anything would have helped him. But he didn't use that one. But my point is that liberals believe themselves to be sort of second-class citizens when it comes to patriotism, when it comes to religion, when it comes to values, when it comes to just sort of speaking for America. And yet, as I said, the liberal position is the American majority position. Not just majority, but supermajority. People who call themselves moderates, by and large, embrace the liberal position on issue after issue after issue after issue after issue. And what the conservatives have successfully done, using a mainstream media that has been sort of, in some ways, beaten into submission, in some ways, talked into submission, but is doing their work for them in large measure. What they have done is by attaching these popular positions to this unpopular term, to this term that no politician wants to associate themselves with, is that they've taken them off the table. They've said, oh, we can't talk about that. That's too liberal. That's, you know, and in fact, if you saw in the 2006 election, as Paul Krugman wrote in the New York Times, Democratic candidates were dragged by their grassroots into taking popular positions. Again and again and again, I'll finish up here. I don't have a very smooth talk, right? I just have a few points I try to make in some rough order. But even if you don't share these positions, even if you are a small C conservative, but also a small D Democrat, you have to ask yourself what's wrong with a system where 65 to 70% of the people say they want universal health care and we don't get it. We certainly pay for it. We certainly pay enough money to get it, but we don't get it. Our healthcare system is one of the most expensive in the world. Again, the taxation policies under George Bush are policies that are supported by a tiny minority. 65% of Americans want us out of Iraq as soon as possible, regardless of what may happen there. And that may be the wrong position, but it's a 65% held position. And by the way, it's the Iraqi people's position too, as far as we know. I mean, in terms of, it's very hard to do a good survey in Iraq, but the one or two surveys that have been done, those are the numbers you get. So the Iraqi people and the American people are united in wanting the United States to leave Iraq. It's just the governments that are not. And so my point is that there's a dangerous democratic bottleneck here, where we're extremely ill-served by our political system. And there are many, many reasons for this, and I'm only talking about one, but it's one that we can solve quite easily by people understanding that the historic traditions associated with liberalism are honorable ones. Liberalism means really very little beyond the legacy of the Enlightenment. Conservatism is actually an ideology. Liberalism is not an ideology. People say, what does it mean to be a liberal? And they think, well, it means you believe in big government. But liberals, there's nothing in the liberal philosophy about big government. It's just some problems require a government to solve them. Some people need government help. And so there isn't any other tool available. There wasn't, you see what happens when you don't have a government in an example like Katrina, or even in Iraq today. I mean, that's what happens when you don't have a government. So it's not that liberals are pro-government as an ideology. It's just that they're not anti-government as an ideology. Liberalism is an incredibly pragmatic creed. It's about people's right. It's in many ways similar to libertarianism. It's about people's right to reach their potential. It's about, more than anything, it's about equality of opportunity. But what liberals say is that you're not all alone in this. It's not up to you to fight these enormous forces out there on your own. That some of these forces are so strong, whether they be big business, whether they be the potential repression from other nations, whether they be certain handicaps you might be born with in terms of society's treatment of certain groups, or maybe you have physical handicaps. But what liberalism says is that as a pragmatic matter, the legacy of the Enlightenment requires institutions that support people in reaching them. That's the difference between classical liberalism, which most conservatives agree with, except for religious conservatives like George Bush. But the dividing line between classical liberalism, which, say, Margaret Thatcher and Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan embrace, and contemporary liberalism, which grows out of the New Deal and the philosophy of John Dewey and later John Rawls, is saying that as a pragmatic matter, these freedoms don't take care of themselves. That society needs to band together, people need to band together and create institutions that allow them to make these values realizable on the ground for individuals. It's not really a very controversial notion, and it explains why, in a case like global warming, why most people are liberals. Most people say, yes, there's a threat, and we should do what we can within reason to address it. With regard to stem cell research, yes, if there's possible solutions and cures for things like Alzheimer's, well, why not, And it's actually the conservatives the Republican Party has been taken over by this extremely conservative group of people who, as I just gave you the stem cell example, but you could take the Iraq example also. One group of people who happen to be brown-skinned and speak Arabic attack you, and you attack an entirely different group of people who happen to be brown-skinned and Arabic, but had nothing whatsoever to do with it. It's just not. It's so ideologically driven now that it doesn't make sense to most people, and which is why it's one reason why you get 60 to 70% embrace of the liberal views, but you don't actually get the policies, and that's, I think, because of the demonization and dishonor that's been attached to this word and these people. So that's what I'm trying to correct with this book. I'm trying to say we have nothing to apologize for, we liberals and this tradition, and that in fact not only are we just as good Americans as you people, but we're the majority of the country. And in that respect, the truth will set you free. The only thing we have to fear is you know what. So, can we talk? I'm done. Thank you. Anybody? Yeah.
So I guess the thing I don't see a place for in sort of the discussion that we've had so far is sort of the place of science and sort of this rise of truthiness. And so in a lot of ways I wouldn't say that I say was a liberal or believe that it was right solely because there was a majority, but in fact I can cite studies about universal pre-K, and not just one study, but a bunch of studies that have been peer-reviewed, etc.
Yeah.
And sort of, it seems like this sort of value of, we've never been closer to facts with the advent of Google than we ever have before, right? We've never been so close to being able to have foreign sources of information as well.
Yeah.
And yet, the place of science, we see, bad decisions in the FDA, we see all these types of things. And it doesn't really fall to a political party, but yet it appears to be, I'm not sure how you describe it. I mean, so the question is, where does that fall in your discussion? And one hates to say that they're a liberal solely because they believe in science.
But you see, that's what we've come to. I mean, I would say you are a classical liberal because you believe in science, because the theme of the Enlightenment as defined by Immanuel Kant was dare to know. So if you allow your knowledge to take you as far as it will go, that's what it means to be a liberal. Now, that's a classical liberal, and there's more steps involved, as I just described, to being a contemporary liberal, but that's the first step. And that's the step that George Bush and the people who run the Republican Party today won't take. I mean, when James Hansen had his, what was he head of the Goddard Space Center? I think that was his title, yeah. When he had his conclusions vetoed by the person writing the press releases for NASA saying he couldn't release that information, that person was a 24-year-old college dropout who said, basically you're just not on message. I mean, if you saw the people who were sent to Iraq to rebuild that society, to create the monetary system, these are people who have no knowledge whatsoever about how to do anything that they're allegedly supposed to do. What they have is demonstrated ideological bona fides. People who were interviewed for jobs in Iraq were asked what was their position on abortion. They were asked, did they show up in Florida, in 2000? Those are the questions that were asked. So it actually, in our society, under this particular administration, these people are so extreme, it is actually controversial to be in favor of knowledge over truthiness. It's in favor, the idea of just being a classical liberal is under attack. And the more people learn about this, the more outraged they are. But again, our political system is in this respect out of whack. I mean, everybody saw what it was in Katrina. Nobody was in favor of the government's response to Katrina, right? Nobody's arguing on behalf of that kind of thing. But if you go back and read the minutes of Brownie's confirmation hearing, he actually is arguing. He's saying, look, it's inappropriate for FEMA to be this well funded, to be this well stocked with experts. It's too big. It's just wrong, period. As an ideological matter, it's wrong for the government to have this kind of capacity, and I intend to destroy it. He made that clear. I mean, the hearing is only about 15 minutes, because at that point, nobody cared about FEMA anymore. That wasn't what they were interested in. But this is the position of the people who rule the Republican Party, or have for the past 8 years. It'll be very interesting, interesting and not in a good way, to see what happens if John McCain should become president, because he will be beholden to these people. And whether he agrees with them or not, he will have to give them their political due. And so even though if you think John McCain is the most wonderful person in the world, even if you think he's your grandmother, as most people in the mainstream media actually do, the idea of who and what are the Republican Party remains incredibly important and incredibly relevant. I mean, how many of you noticed when Mitt Romney gave that speech about why it was okay that he was a Mormon and why Christian conservatives should support him even though some of them didn't consider Christian? He gave exactly the opposite speech that John Kennedy gave in 1960 about separating religion from politics. He said, just because I have these particular religious views, that's a reason to support me. When George Bush appointed Harriet Mears to be on the Supreme Court, he made no arguments that she had any legal qualifications to be at the Supreme Court. He said, she's a good Christian. She attends a really conservative church. And that was the entire argument. So yeah, it's an anti-Enlightenment position that they've taken. And that's one reason why people who have embraced the liberal position on all of these things are uncomfortable with that label, because they never thought that just to be in favor of science or knowledge is to take a liberal position. But in fact it is. That's what classical liberalism began as. Long answer, short question. Sorry. Anybody else? Yes.
Hi, thanks for being here, first of all. I was wondering if you had any quick suggestions for those of us. I have a lot of very conservative family members, some conservative friends that go way back, so I can't really,
I wouldn't
stay away from them.
ask you to, yeah.
Yeah, no, but, a lot of these cliche accusations that you address in the book, I face a lot in conversation, which is, your point about Romney's speech on religion, and I'm against that speech, or I make a comment about that speech, and suddenly I'm anti-religion.
Yeah.
Even though personally, it has nothing to do with with me.
I'm a reasonably
What are just some
religious person.
suggestions to countering that, the Bill O'Reilly effect, if you will? Like what?
Yeah, well, my book has been criticized because I don't actually offer, one-liners for politicians and for people that I try and do justice to the complexity of some of these issues. I mean, if you just take the case of religion, religion is terribly important in the history of liberalism. I mean, all of the great social movements have been in some measure religious movements of the past century. I mean, obviously Martin Luther King and his speeches about letting freedom flow like a mighty river, I mean, these are taken directly from scriptures. And if you look at the people who I put as my favorite 42 liberals, a lot of them are religious figures, not just King, but Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. If you look here, I put Jesus on, too, because Jesus was liberal. By the way, so was Adam Smith. Adam Smith was a big liberal. The two people that they're always beating us over the heads with are our own people. I mean, you have to, the problem with being a liberal is you have to make careful distinctions. And this is one thing to say that it's inappropriate for George Bush to do something because God tells him to. It's inappropriate for George Bush to try and win an argument on the basis of what he knows God thinks. But it's entirely appropriate for people to be inspired to act in the public sphere because of their own personal faith. I mean, in other words, your faith should work inside you, but you shouldn't expect your faith to trump other people's reason. Now, that sounds a little complicated. But that's actually not so bad. It gets a lot worse in some areas. We have a tougher case to make. And liberals are, if you read these studies that have come out of Berkeley lately, liberals are more attracted to complexity than conservatives are. Like, if you listen to these Limbaugh and Rush and Bill O'Reilly and this guy Michael Savage on talk radio, you really can't believe what you hear. I mean, you can't believe anybody could be this stupid to swallow this stuff. But I'm not saying that I'll let John Stuart Mill say it so I don't get beaten up for this. John Stuart Mill. I never meant to say that conservatives are generally stupid. I meant to say that stupid people are generally conservative. I believe that this is so obviously and universally admitted a principle that I hardly think any gentleman will deny it. There's something attractive to people about the simplicity of conservatism and the truthiness of it, and it attracts a lot of stupid people. And 40 million of them enjoy Rush Limbaugh and Bill O'Reilly and Michael Savage. A much larger number than watch the CBS, NBC, and Evening News, twice the number actually, or subscribe to the major newspapers. So it's a real problem. But if they're your family and they're your friends, you can talk to them. You don't. I mean, that's easy. That's the easy part. The harder part is getting past all that noise out there. You could buy them a book too.
How do we approach this problem that the media is so dominated by these conservative voices, even when they're completely out of step with the communities that they're purported to be representing?
Yeah.
And a media that at the very top levels of the opinion media in Washington, which is completely dominated by these people who are, for whatever reason, are completely in bed with or in love with McCain and are sort of inherently hostile to the Democratic candidates.
Well, I was always hoping that Google would buy the Wall Street Journal and ask my advice about who to appoint the editorial page editor, but I couldn't get any response on that. I used to go around saying, if anybody knows the Google guys, will you bring this up with them? One of my friends went pretty far along the line in being vice president for strategy or something in Washington, but took himself out of the running. I thought I had an inside line on that. The media problem is complex for a lot of reasons. One reason I wrote I've written a few books on it, and one problem with the media is that we're down to 6 companies that control the vast majority of what people see and hear. We had 50 in the 1970s. The number has consolidated to just 6, and 50 wasn't very many to begin with. And so these corporations that own all of these interlocking interests have no interest in creating problems for themselves. I mean, if you ever, I don't know if you've seen a chart of like what Disney owns now, but it's astonishing. And if you work for ABC News, you have to think about that chart every time you open your mouth, because you don't want to bring the wrong kind of attention to yourself. When Mike Kinsley was the editor of Slate, he said a very useful thing. He said, don't ever expect Slate to do an investigative report on Microsoft. We'll try and tell the truth as best we can when it comes up, but don't look to us to go looking for trouble here. That's just not human nature. We work for these people. It's a business. So concentration is a triple-edged sword. I don't know if there are triple-edged swords. That makes it's a sword. It's a triple-edged sword in the following respects. One is that it reduces the number of voices in the marketplace when you're looking for truth. Number 2 is it reduces the conflicts of interest are so vast and so myriad that it turns everything into a kind of pablum. And third, it gives these people far more power than is healthy in a democracy. When the McCain-Feingold bill was passed, only one part of it actually was voted down. I was surprised it was passed at all, but the part of it that was voted down was the part that would have forced the television networks to sell airtime to candidates at their lowest rates. That part was defeated. The broadcast networks got what they want. Nobody else did. How many of you have heard of the Telecommunications Act of 1996? Is this the kind of place everybody knows where that is? Okay. So that was an incredibly important law. It deregulated radio. It's the reason why radio stinks in most places. But it also changed the whole cable landscape and everything in the country. The words Telecommunications Act of 1996, and it was a very long battle that was fought in Congress between the lobbyists of all sides. The words Telecommunications Act of 1996 were never once said in prime time on American television during the entire battle while it was taking place. Actually, let me correct myself. Those words were said twice. Once outside of prime time by Ted Koppel, who did a single nightline on it, and once in prime time on a Sunday night. Any guess who said them? Who said those 4 words? Yeah, 4 words. Lisa Simpson. The only time it was ever mentioned, because media power is real power. And it's funny, Bob Dole wanted to be a good guy when he was running against Bill Clinton on this issue, because Congress was voting to give away the spectrum to the broadcast companies, the broadcast spectrum, which it was estimated was worth between $30 and $70 billion in an open auction. And he wanted to have one achievement that he could run on that Congress had done, because Congress wasn't getting anything passed, and show that he was doing the people's business. And he picked that one. And then his advisors, and he made the announcement. It was all sort of out there. And then his advisor said, Bob, dude, who do you think is going to be covering your campaign? Are you crazy? These are the people we need more than anyone to run an effective campaign. And the idea went away, and the broadcast spectrum was given away. It was given for free to the companies that already owned the analog spectrum, in exchange for promises to convert things in ways that are then put off forever and ever and ever. So the concentration problem is a big one, and so is what I consider to be the conservative problem. The conservative problem is partially the fact that most of these corporations are economically conservative, and so are the well-to-do reporters who work for them. But also partially just because conservatives are much better at what I call working the refs, at making, they've invested a fortune in these organizations that kick and scream and yell every time something doesn't go their way. And if you think about a basketball game or a hockey game, when somebody's working the ref can either kick them out of the place, but you can't kick out conservatives from the political arena. You can either listen, or you can listen to what they're saying and see if they make some good points, or you can just throw them a few calls in the hope that they'll shut up. And what the media have done during this period is throw them a few calls and listen to them, in both cases, because they can't kick them out. And they've won enormous victories. And liberals, for a long time, thought the media were on their side. They thought the media were their team and didn't do any of this. So the field was completely open to conservatives. And it's only in the past 4 or 5 years that liberals have woken up to that this is a contested arena and they need to fight back. And they have fought back, and it's a much healthier situation for liberals, not because it's a fair fight, but just because there's some place to go to fight. But it's still a big problem. Yeah.
Just to follow up on my own question, it seems like
Wait for the microphone, please.
Oh, sorry. To follow up on my own question, it seems like part of the problem is that liberals are sort of conflicted about it, because a lot of what the conservatives have done is delegitimize the media.
Yep.
And therefore, it's difficult, I think, sort of for liberals to do that because, A, as you say, they perceive the media as being on their side, but B, because they're going to be essentially finishing off the job that the conservatives started, which is, I think, at this point inevitable, though.
Well, the internet is on the liberal side, though.
Yeah.
The internet has changed things.
Well,
And
the truth is it has a notorious liberal bias.
No, it's changed things in the following respect. I'm not saying it's equalized things. It has actually equalized money, which is historic. I mean, it's for the first time in history, the side of capital doesn't have more money than the side of labor because of the ability of the internet to inspire small donors. And that's fantastic. But it's also created, I have a long article in the New Yorker this week about the role of internet journalism, and it's accomplished two things. I mean, it's not perfect, a lot of problems with it. And I worry about what's going to happen to reporting when these newspapers die off or shrink to a fraction of the size that they are now, which they all will. But what it's done is it's made possible democratic communication outside of the realm of the mainstream media, so that groups can get their own information from elsewhere. You know, you can read The Guardian, or you can get some little guy in Iraq and he can send a blog post, and people can inform themselves about things without sort of the gatekeepers who define what's news and what's appropriate, and that's good and bad, but for liberals it's basically good. And the second thing the internet does, the blogosphere has done, is it's done a much better job of holding the mainstream media accountable for what they print and say, because very few reporters make much money. Reporting doesn't pay very well. Reporting is all about ego, you know. Your friends who you grew up with in college, if you were a smart person in college, they all make many times what you make in law firms and investment banks and in the technology field, for sure. But a reporter, people know your name and you feel kind of powerful and you feel like you're doing good work. And if you can be embarrassed, if your name can be shown to be, if you're shown to be a kind of fake, which most reporters actually, I think they are, it's very effective. So the internet and the corrections, and it's not a coincidence that newspapers have started hiring ombudsmen, even though they're canning workers left and right and reporters left and right, because the internet has caught their mistakes right away. And it's made a big difference. When my friend Josh Marshall pointed out that Strom Thurmond, that Trent Lott was praising a segregationist presidential campaign, and turned out to have a history of close associations with segregationist groups, Trent Lott lost his position as Republican Senate Majority Leader. The thing that was interesting about that is that the room was filled with reporters when he made these statements, but none of the reporters thought it was interesting. None of the reporters thought it was worth thinking about. Everybody thought it was business as usual. But the internet forced the mainstream media to look into his record and found that he had all of these unsustainable and indefensible associations. So in this respect, this is one reason why I'm happy to be employed by one of these groups, Media Matters, but also that I think people have a much more of a sense of agency than they did in the past.
We have time for one more question.
I'm going to cheat and ask two. Could it be that conservatives are spread out because even they don't want to live next to one? My real question, though, was when more than half of the population holds certain principles and values, how is that not moderate rather than one end of the political spectrum or
Oh,
another?
I mean, but the terms themselves have, the word moderate has no real meaning, right? It's like centrist. It just means not one thing and not the other, not too hot, not too cold. But what I'm saying is that the word liberal is attached to these positions for the purpose of delegitimating them. That if you set up a debate on cable TV or even on the more respectable shows on Sunday morning, the liberal position is the one that actually most moderates hold and most people hold, and yet it is already on the defensive, if not illegitimate, for having been attached to this label. So, I'm personally attached to the label because I think it's a good label with an honorable history, and I like it. I'm happy to be called it. But the label itself is not so important. What's important is the kind of country we live in and the kind of, the future that we give our children, my daughter and the, sort of what Thomas Jefferson called the good reputation of mankind. And I think that the attack on liberalism, which is in many ways an attack on the Enlightenment and the values of equality of opportunity and truth, is one big reason why our country is in a state that so few of us can be proud of it, and it has so little respect abroad. I think that this attack on liberalism has created a political bottleneck that is preventing the essential the decency of the American people from being reflected in their government and their behavior around the world. And there's just no good reason for it. So, I'm hoping to provide the intellectual vitamins to beat it up. Thank you. Thanks for listening.